This video features the installation of our street kit. However, kits are available in different configurations based on the torque being produced at the crankshaft and your style of driving. The installation procedure will be the same except for the disc being used. While this video provides the basics on how to switch out a clutch, it is in no way intended to replace a factory service manual. Disconnect the negative terminal of the battery. Loosen the clamp at the front of the intake chamber. Remove the bolts securing the intake chamber to the intercooler bracket and then remove the intake chamber. Unfasten the bolt securing the left side of the intercooler to the bracket. Remove the bolt securing the PCV pipes to the intercooler and unfasten the bolt securing the right side of the intercooler to the bracket. Loosen the clamp securing the intercooler to the throttle body. Unfasten the air bypass valve from the intercooler. Loosen the clamp securing the intercooler to the turbo and then remove the intercooler. Unbolt the ground wire and bracket from the transmission located above the slave cylinder. Remove all wiring to the starter and then unbolt and remove the starter. Unbolt the slave cylinder from the transmission. Do not open the hydraulic system. Remove the return spring from the clutch fork. Disconnect the transmission ground wire. Unbolt and remove the upper engine support. Disconnect the wiring harness for the rear oxygen sensor and the neutral position and backup lamp switch. Unfasten and remove the splash guard. Disengage and remove the heat shield over the turbo. Unbolt the top of the exhaust flange from the turbo and remove the heat shield bracket. Unbolt the bottom of the exhaust flange from the turbo. Unbolt the exhaust flange located after the catalytic converter. Remove the bolt securing the catalytic converter to the transmission. Separate the flanges and then remove the catalytic converter and the lower turbo heat shield. Disconnect the electrical plug for the rear oxygen sensor. Unbolt the bracket securing the center section of the exhaust to the transmission. Unfasten the rearmost exhaust flange and remove the center section of the exhaust from the vehicle. Remove the heat shield from the center of the vehicle. Remove the lower plug and drain the transmission. Reinstall the plug and tighten it to 37 foot-pounds. Unlock both axle nuts by lifting the crimp portions using a drift or a punch. Unfasten and remove both axle nuts. Unbolt and remove both passenger and driver front wheel and tire assemblies. On the passenger side, unbolt the lower ball joint and remove it from the housing. Remove the axle from the hub, then remove the axle from the transmission. On the driver's side, unbolt the lower ball joint and remove it from the housing. Remove the axle from the hub, then remove the axle from the transmission. Mark the rear driveshaft flange yoke and differential so that upon installation it can be indexed in the same position. Unfasten the rear driveshaft flange yoke, unbolt the center bearing, and remove the driveshaft. Place a stand under the transmission case. Unbolt and remove the transmission crossmember assembly. Uncouple the reverse check cable and unbolt the transmission stay. Then lower both the transmission stay and check cable. Unbolt and disengage the gear selector shaft from the transmission. Unfasten the plug on the upper driver's side of the transmission. Install a 6mm bolt into the release lever shaft and then pull the shaft out of the transmission. Place a jack under the transmission. Unfasten the bell housing hardware, then lift the release lever to free it from the release bearing. This will allow the bearing to stay attached to the pressure plate but free the transmission so it can be disengaged from the engine. Disengage the transmission from the engine and carefully remove it from under the vehicle. Remove the release lever from the transmission and clean the guide tube, input shaft splines, and pilot shaft. Lube the guide tube, input shaft splines, and pilot shaft using the Ceram lube included with your clutch kit. Slide the disc onto the input shaft to work the lube into the splines. Remove the disc and wipe off any excess lube to prevent contamination of your new clutch. Place Ceram lube on the pivoting surfaces and the inner sliding surface of the release bearing. Then install the bearing onto the guide tube. Install the release lever into position, making sure the forks are inside the tabs of the release bearing. Install the release lever shaft, making sure the slot slips over the pin in the transmission. Remove the 6mm bolt and then install and tighten the plug to 35 foot-pounds. Unfasten the inspection cover to give you enough room to remove the pressure plate and flywheel. Unbolt and remove the old pressure plate and disc. Unbolt and remove the old flywheel. On this vehicle, we will be installing our heavy-duty pressure plate and performance street disc along with our street light flywheel. Mount the flywheel using new factory attachment bolts and tighten the bolts to 55 foot-pounds in a star pattern. Clean both the pressure plate and flywheel friction surfaces with a non-petroleum based cleaner. Place the disc into position, holding it in place with the alignment tool. Install the pressure plate using new factory pressure plate bolts. Gradually tighten all the bolts in a star pattern while making sure the disc is centered, and then torque them to 25 foot-pounds, also in a star pattern. Remove the alignment tool. Reinstall the inspection cover and tighten the hardware. Lift the transmission back into place and install bell housing hardware. Torque them to 37 foot-pounds. Install the gear selector shaft and tighten the hardware to 9 foot-pounds. Place the reverse check cable and transmission stay up into place. Install the retaining clip securing the reverse check cable and tighten the hardware for the transmission stay to 24 foot-pounds. Remove the jack from under the transmission and place a stand under the transmission case. Place the transmission crossmember assembly in position and install the hardware. Tighten the 4 rear bolts to 51 foot-pounds and the 2 front bolts to 103 foot-pounds. Remove the stand from under the transmission case. Place the drive shaft up into position, making sure to align the marks made during disassembly. Install the bolts for the center bearing hand tight for now. Install the hardware at the rear of the drive shaft and tighten them to 23 foot-pounds. Tighten the bolts for the center bearing to 38 foot-pounds. Place the lower turbo heat shield and catalytic converter up into position. Install the hardware and heat shield bracket at the top of the exhaust flange as well as the lower hardware. Tighten them to 31 foot-pounds. Install the heat shield over the turbo and tighten the hardware for both the upper and lower heat shields. Install and tighten the bolt securing the catalytic converter to the transmission. On the passenger side, install the axle into the transmission and then install it into the hub. On the driver's side, install the axle into the transmission and then install it into the hub. Place the lower ball joint into the housing and then tighten the hardware to 37 foot-pounds. On the passenger side, place the lower ball joint into the housing and tighten the hardware to 37 foot-pounds. Seat the release bearing into the pressure plate by pushing the release lever toward the firewall. You should hear a noticeable click. Pull the release fork toward the engine. If it does not contact the case, the bearing should be seated correctly. Reinstall the rubber boot over the release lever. Install the slave cylinder to the transmission and then install the return spring for the clutch fork. Mount the heat shield at the center of the vehicle. Install the center section of the exhaust, making sure to place the hanger into the rubber isolator. Install the hardware hand tight on the exhaust flange located after the catalytic converter. Install and tighten the hardware at the rearmost exhaust flange, then tighten the hardware located after the catalytic converter. Reinstall the bracket securing the center section of the exhaust to the transmission. Reconnect the electrical plug for the rear oxygen sensor. Mount the starter back into place and tighten the hardware to 37 foot-pounds. Reconnect all wiring to the starter and then install the ground wire and bracket located above the slave cylinder. Reconnect the wiring harness for the rear oxygen sensor and the neutral position and backup lamp switch. Install the transmission ground wire. Fit the upper engine support back into position. Tighten the front hardware to 37 foot-pounds and the rear hardware to 43 foot-pounds. Set the intercooler back into position. Tighten the clamp securing the intercooler to the throttle body. Tighten the clamp securing the intercooler to the turbo. Install the air bypass valve to the intercooler and tighten the hardware. Install and tighten the bolts securing the PCV pipes to the intercooler. Install and tighten the bolt securing the right side of the intercooler to the bracket. Install and tighten the bolt securing the left side of the intercooler to the bracket. Install the intake chamber and tighten the hardware securing it to the bracket. Then tighten the clamp. On the driver's side, install the axle nut and torque it to 162 foot-pounds while no load is on the bearing. Lock the nut using a punch or a drift. On the passenger side, install the axle nut and torque it to 162 foot-pounds while no load is on the bearing. Lock the nut using a punch or a drift. Install both passenger and driver tire and wheel assemblies and torque the lug nuts to 88 foot-pounds. Install the splash guard. Remove the transmission fill plug and fill the transmission with the factory specified fluid type and amount. Install the fill plug and tighten it to 37 foot-pounds. Reconnect the negative cable to the battery and tighten the terminal.
If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching.